Standard human greetings, fellow mortals. I thought I could do some homework today, but no, I have to do this shit instead. And at this point, I'm just beating a dead horse. But to that, I say, would you rather I beat a live horse? Right. Welcome back. Today, I want to talk to you about how to spot fake history like Graham Hancock spots a sucker. So I'm going to follow in his footsteps, capitalize on a popular idea at the moment, which is Graham Hancock, and also include how to actually see what bullshit he's pulling. And of course, it's not just Graham Hancock, but a number of other people and programs that contribute and kind of use this play by play that I'm going to highlight for you. So let's get right into the point here. So usually they'll set the stage with a familiar archaeological site, then ask, "But what if we were wrong all along?" Then the silhouetted host walks through a doorway, probably wearing an Indiana Jones hat, and then the opening theme begins. This takes us into the aesthetic part of my point here, and so we're going to give you some alt history show opening theme design 101. So show the following images fading one into the other in any order with hand drum and sitar heavy music. Bonus points for vague ululating by someone off screen. Establish hints of spiritualism with a tarot card, the Eye of Horus, or the eye and pyramid on US currency with successive cuts closing in on the image. Next, pan across an ancient temple from left to right to suggest the viewer isn't on their couch but traveling the world. Next, World War II airplane. Then several more jump cuts between different illustrations of mythical creatures from medieval texts. Someone acting out a slow motion version of human sacrifice. A sped up sun coming up or going down or both because symbolism. An atomic bomb explosion. Actors in sandals as ancient Mesopotamians unfurling a scroll instead of looking at tablets for some reason. Then a black and white series of clips of the Third Reich or the Great Depression. Bonus points then for clips of FDR, JFK, or MLK giving speeches. Someone riding a camel in a different sunset. A star map with a wheel of zodiac signs that rotates, and then the signs all flash white with sound effects because magic. Go to a scientist peering into a vial or holding a clipboard. Dramatic catastrophe porn of a famous building under a Sienna zombie movie filter, suggesting Western society is crumbling as we know it. Then go to a time-lapsed growth and decay of plants. Someone squinting at Stonehenge, flames moving in slow-mo, and the final hum of instruments on your logo. So after that, you will come into a Victorian inspired study often, and the host will, sit in front of a stack of antique books and describe to you what it is that they're going to be eventually globetrotting to figure out this episode. And every once in a while, over background footage of an airplane that is going to whatever continent the host has insisted is worth going to answer this question, you'll see exhibits, and those exhibits are the things that punctuate the point of the host. And they might be photographs or archival footage or clips of an artifact at a museum, for example. And even these are curated in a very particular way to suggest to the audience that this is real living history that we are showing to you at this point. And even that is a bit disingenuous, because if they have a clean, perfect photo and a tarnished or damaged photo, they're going to show you the damaged one. Because the more raw and damaged these historical exhibits are, the more authority an audience member wants to grant to the program offering these historical exhibits. So it's definitely a way to get you as an audience member to relinquish your disbelief and to come in a little bit more earnestly to what the host is ultimately going to try to tell you. So as we continue, just keep that in mind, because you are going to see it repeatedly, and it is absolutely designed to manipulate you into believing them. And I got a lot of this information from the History Channel Effect by Jeremy D. Stoddard. And in my alternate history series, I kind of go over that in a more expanded way. So definitely check that out if you're interested in learning more about the History Channel Effect. Okay, so next we are going to talk about the people that are in these kinds of shows. Because often there will be the host, but you'll also see different quote-unquote experts in single interview style clips. Basically, they bring together people who are considered fringe, who probably don't get a lot of attention in more professional circles, in addition to amateur hobbyists who have no motive to be unbiased or even discerning in their theories or the quote-unquote evidence they use. When they do use professionals in, like, the fields of archaeology, for example, the interviews are designed to glean certain responses that can be edited together to suggest an air of mystery when the expert really suggested nothing of the sort. What I'm dancing around here is that experts who flatly say one thing will be edited to say something else. They're, in bad faith, taking the words of an expert, rearranging them, and selling you something that is open to interpretation. That's just television. But you will notice you'll get much longer cuts of either the hobbyist or the fringe people, because they're more wildly entertaining. An expert is more conservative with their words because they understand the layers of nuance that history and archaeology demand. And that can be really dry to a lay audience. The expert then will be used sparingly when they've made a very direct statement, so the fringe people can be punctuated with someone who has a PhD to lend credence to the program overall. You'll also notice that all of the contributing personalities are isolated from one another. They don't want to put a bunch of conspiracy theorist types in the room with a professor, for example, because the professor could likely out-argue those conspiracy theorists because it's basically what they do for a living. Imagine teaching the same introductory course to an archaeology or historical subject, and each year or each semester you have to encounter the same types of people that say, but on Ancient Aliens this happens. Because that certainly does happen. And from that day-to-day, or at least semester to semester practice, you would have somebody who has kind of honed the skills of dealing with people who come from a place not of maliciousness, but deeply ingrained ignorance. And so it would be very easy for someone like that to say, well, actually, but in, an air of actual knowledge rather than just actuallyism. So unfortunately, such an arrangement would quash any notion of mystery pretty quickly. So obviously, the showrunners would not want that to happen. As Norm Macdonald said, that's the worst you can be, a guy smarter than the audience. They're gonna hate you. So this brings us to kind of the purpose of having all of these people edited the way that they are. They want the audience to be able to decide what is historical truth. If they answer the question for you that they start the entire episode with, why would you, their audience, come back to watch next week? They're empowering you to decide history rather than educating you with the sources from that history. They're telling you that even without years of peer-reviewed research and work, you know enough from the previous 20 minutes reenactment footage and tourism B-roll that your opinion is as valid as those who have made this research their life's work. Why? Because it's a form of comfort. To control the entire human narrative in a random world. And that sort of power is addictive. You'll also notice that they don't set apart people with PhDs versus the hobbyists or the people that do not have official credentials in whatever subject it is that they're talking about. And this would sound almost democratically ideal. Why shouldn't everyone have a voice? But let me explain kind of what my dismay is all about. Would you give equal merit to a choice between a salad and gasoline for lunch? Not all of the choices presented are edible and safe to eat, right? Likewise, while not all fringe theories are directly dangerous the way that consuming gasoline would be dangerous, we have to learn to recognize what theories are quote-unquote edible for us and what are not. Granted, a long time ago, the options were between the standard of the time, a geocentric planetary model, versus Galileo's heliocentric model. Galileo sounded completely absurd. So absurd, in fact, that he was restricted to house arrest for the rest of his life. But you know what he had? Cold, hard evidence. He saw a flaw in the geocentric model, did his research, and presented a new interpretation. He didn't start with a rejection of the church's model just to be a contrarian, and his ideas were so indisputable the authorities were actually afraid of him. He never had to say, "But what if?" Now let's hop back over to the single host going abroad model. I always find it so funny that alt history people will point at actual evidence that supports what they call the mainstream narrative and tell you why it supports whatever narrative they're selling to you in their next book, out next spring. In fact, they could be showing you these historical sites or artifacts even while asking if they represent a false narrative. They go to some exotic locale because Google Images canonically does not exist in their universe. Their research inevitably requires traveling to interesting places where they can be filmed cosplaying as Uncharted. Looking at you, Bright Insight. You'll notice also that their hard work and research always requires that they travel, because that's on someone else's dime, and they want you to know that they sacrifice so much to bring you the truth with a capital T. They will point then to an artifact or a site and ensure they're seen walking around in the sun so they can wear their hat, or in a tunnel where they are required to either stoop or scoot around to show you how adventurous they are. They tell you they're some sort of renegade going against the established thought. Some just hint and smirk that big archaeology wants to oppress the voices of, like rogues, like the host. They do not name who funds big archaeology. Meanwhile, they have a corporate sponsor. You never see them citing specific academic sources. If they do, you have to ask yourself, who are those sources? How old are they? And how easy does the host make it for you to look them up yourself? They make unfounded claims about the complexity of creating whatever artifact or building they're standing in front of. They'll be like, its measurements are impossibly precise, but they won't have any measuring tools in hand. If they do have a tool, they don't tell you what it's called or how it works, or even give you any kind of context as the audience. They'll be like, it dates older than Giza, and they don't have any way of translating the hieroglyphs for you. They don't show you why it's older than Giza. They just tell you that it's older than Giza because that's what some tour guide said who wanted you to tip him well. Who could have possibly built all this? They'll gasp in front of a likeness of the guy that had it built. And whatever answer they give, they're ultimately suggesting that the people who lived there when the artifact or site was made could never have been so accomplished. Meanwhile, there are a number of research articles you can find for free that explain in detail their experimental archaeology, wherein they use ancient technology to do the exact things with the same materials the host claims are impossible. They never seem to read those, let alone offer any rebuttal with evidence. And if you find that there's an article that you want to read that's behind a specific paywall, try tweeting or emailing the expert who wrote it, because they don't get enough money for what they've written, if any, from the journal that publishes it. So more than likely, if they see your email, they'll probably just send you a copy. Next, let's talk about funding. Please do not forget that even if you're watching something on YouTube or Netflix or the television, that your viewership always lines the pockets of somebody. Additionally, the money follows the viewers, and that creates and reveals and creates again bias. A show's viewership is obviously monitored by the network or service that owns it. The subsequent seasons of that show will then court their biggest group of viewers and kind of appeal to the lowest common denominator thereof. Let me just read to you a quote from Stoddard. History Channel produced programs in particular can be extremely inaccurate as a result of low production budgets, use of out-of-context images and video, little or no historical oversight, and a desire to appeal to middle-aged male audiences by emphasizing warfare and patriotism. Likewise, if you're watching something and you're like, oh my god, it's so woke, yeah, that's probably trying to appeal to a more progressive audience, right? No matter what, you're going to see some kind of bias. It's completely inevitable. So I don't want you to see bias and think, oh, I need to stop watching this. But to recognize it and be aware of it is how you stay most informed. The presence of bias does not automatically make something unworthy of watching or listening to, but to be aware of that bias will help you to understand who they think their main audience is, who their target audience is, and who it is that is going to continue to make them money. When you figure that out, you see exactly why they're making the content that they are making. Finally, you'll notice that no single truth is endorsed. They do this to maintain their initial hook question throughout their episode. The longer you watch, the better for their profits. They tend to close on a, quote, persistent aura of mystery, and that this, quote, seemed to do more to fuel cultural myths than dispel them. Finally, I wanted to end this video by saying it's not intended to make anyone dislike a form of entertainment. What it is designed to do is to inform consumers of that type of content about how alternate history programming and pseudo-history, pseudoarchaeology, can manipulate its viewers into believing claims the program itself doesn't even endorse or support, while dodging any responsibility for introducing doubt about a subject in the first place. They're not revealing hidden truths to you. They're feeding you entertainment with an anthropological and archaeological veneer, and using a vague interpretation of spiritism instead of academia as their authoritative source, because one requires knowledge of APA citation format and the other requires a third eye. So the next time you're watching one of these shows, keep in mind the aesthetic, in which they have some kind of opening theme, the set design, and what kind of exhibits they show you on the screen. Think about the personalities who are contributing to this show and whether they're being isolated from one another, and how the audience is encouraged to decide the historical truth that's being kind of pushed. Consider as well how the amateur opinions are presented as on par with those of PhD holders. Consider as well the evidence with which they are trying to support their thesis statement or their supposed thesis statement, and how that evidence is misused or even lacking, and where you can find their own sources of research and perhaps read some of your own that counter that research so that you can come to your own conclusions. Think about who their target audience is based on how they frame certain subjects, ignore others, and misconstrue possibly even more. Finally, keep in mind that they are going to end on that air of mystery and ask you to participate in the deciding of that history, because that's what's very comforting to people who watch these sorts of shows. And again, while there's nothing wrong with having a guilty pleasure, it is really important to watch these kinds of things very mindfully. With this list that I've made, I intend to review Graham Hancock's new series on Netflix, in addition to many YouTubers who are very, very liberal with what we understand as the truth because of the evidence that we have for it. So hopefully you enjoyed this, and hopefully you found it, if not helpful, at least somewhat entertaining. And I would love if you would join me for the review of Hancock's series, which is hopefully coming soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.